Maybe he is born of grit and hellfire. By all Marvel know, get off my sheets. Chapter 8. Zaya stormed out of his front door, nearly plowing into Jessica as she exited the elevator, who shifted out of the way just in time to stop her from knocking both her and Peter onto the ground. Sorry, Zaya said shortly, whirling into the elevator. Jessica saw Malcolm hanging in the doorway, a pained expression on his face. He had no doubt that Jess heard Zaya screaming at him 2 weeks ago when he'd confessed to what he'd done with the stripper at Mike's bachelor party, and as embarrassed as he was then, he was even more embarrassed now. Sorry about that, he said, unable to meet her gaze, and raised eyebrows. His eyes caught her outfit instead. Hello, Catwoman. Hit a bit of a rough patch? She asked dryly, fishing for her keys and totally ignoring his amused observation. Breaking up, he said with a grimace. My fault. What, did you bone another member of Hogarth's staff? She asked, not at all seriously. A stripper, he admitted grimly, at another co-worker's bachelor party. She looked at him sharply, hazel eyes narrowed to suspicious points. That's not like you. Simultaneously, Malcolm was elated, relieved, gratified that she thought so well of his character, and felt like the worst sort of pond scum that he admitted his shitty behavior to her face. He shrugged, miserable and disgusted with himself. Apparently it is, though. Jess gave him another appraising stare, this one a bit less harsh, as the lock clicked open. She pushed it open with her hip and gestured him inside with a jerk of her head. Hesitantly he followed as she gently pried Peter's fingers from around her neck and laid him down on the couch. There are two kinds of cheaters, she said without pussyfooting around it, her bluntness oddly soothing. Jess wasn't like Hogarth. She wouldn't hide ugly truths and horrible requests in delicate language. The greedy and the cowardly. Yeah, Malcolm winced. Which one am I? The greedy are hopeless. They'll never learn from their mistakes, and they'll cheat again and again because they have no impulse control and they do whatever feels good in the moment. In a way, it's easier, though you can predict on them being awful, and you'll always be right. Cowards are harder to catch, but less likely to be repeat offenders. They don't cheat because they can't help themselves. They do it because they aren't satisfied with the way their life looks, and they don't have the guts to admit it. To their partners, maybe even to themselves. They can't admit that they want something else, not necessarily better, she added dryly, just different. Of course, the worst of all of these are both greedy cowards who leave trails of broken people behind them because they promise their love and devotion to one person over and over again, but inevitably screw them over. So you tell me, which are you? When my choices are no self-control and no guts, or both? He shot back. You did the deed, she replied coolly, sitting Peter's pumpkin bucket on the dining room table and pulling off his shoes and socks. Not me. Malcolm stared at his bare feet before muttering, You sound like her. Your girlfriend? Jess asked, wrapping Peter in a blanket and lifting him into her arms again. She sounds pretty smart. Not surprising, I guess. Hogarth wouldn't tolerate a moron. You should figure out what you want and try to get her back. No. Not Zaya, he said with an embarrassed cough. The stripper. She told me people see her because there's something missing at home. She told me to figure out what I want before I made a stupid mistake like asking Zaya to marry me. Jessica shrugged, absently swaying on the balls of her feet while holding Peter. Problem solved then. It's as simple as that. What do you want? It was undoubtedly a rhetorical question, but Malcolm suddenly had to press his teeth down on the inside of his cheek before he could blurt it out. You, his mouth wanted to say. It wouldn't have been a convenient revelation at any time, but somehow it was especially terrible and gut-wrenching to have it standing right in front of her in Jessica's brand new living room while she rocked her sleeping son. Jessica glanced at him as she cleaned up the living room and blinked. She seemed to have broken Malcolm's brain. "It can't be that bad," she said, bland and pitiless, as she examined his expression somewhere between constipated stress and like someone had shot his dog in front of him. "At least you didn't marry her. Zaya or the stripper." "Uh-huh," he said stupidly. Rolling her eyes at him, Jess wandered into Peter's room and tucked him in, leaving Malcolm to mull over whatever discovery he'd had. He could stand there with his mouth open to catch flies all night, for all she cared. She just wanted to get the hell out of this cat suit now. A tiny part of her had to admit that she was a little worried. Jessica hadn't seen him that emotional since the night she'd written him off. Sitting down hard on Jess's sofa, Malcolm's first coherent thought was when. When had this happened? How long had he been in love with Jessica? And it was love. Now that he'd seen it, now that he'd brought light upon something that had always lived in darkness, there was no way to unsee it. It was taking up all the space in his ribcage. Painful and insistent and present, the answer he found was almost as devastating as the realization itself. The distant image of her blue tinged in streetlights, round belly pushing out the line of skulls on her dress. Always. Kilgrave had so thoroughly wrapped his life around her that Malcolm hadn't noticed what was lingering beneath the haze of drugs, beneath the piercing gratitude he felt for her mercy. And sober, he realized, head hanging between his knees. Sober, I behaved like a child. I'd rather face their pain and their anger than this loneliness I feel around you. Whining at her like a little kid, no worse than a little kid, he thought, abashed. He couldn't picture Peter throwing that in her face, whining at her even after Jessica had pushed him away, shoved him aside, warned him that bad things happened around her. Malcolm hadn't listened to her warnings, and then he'd seen her walking with Luke, and he ran his mouth off at her like an angry child. With years of hindsight able to assist him now, he could see that rant was 90% fueled by jealousy. Then when he'd stayed, he was so eager to impress her, to win the esteem of Jessica, the unimpressible, that he'd conspired with Trish behind her back, and Trish, oh my God, he moaned, covering his face with his hands. Trish was beautiful and allowed herself to be more accessible than Jessica, so he'd convinced himself that it was her that Malcolm wanted to pursue. And of course she let him. Trish was using him, and she was smart enough to see how thirsty he was to have Jessica's approval, even if she hadn't guessed the real reason why. "Oh my God," he said again, wishing that the earth would swallow him whole. I didn't mean to, break your brain or anything," Jess said, watching him from the kitchen doorway. His heart skipped a beat and then started racing madly. His own mortification wouldn't allow him to absorb it earlier, but now Malcolm couldn't help but see how beautiful, how healthy she was looking lately. Nobody ever told him that being in love felt like dying. Or maybe that was just the way he felt about Jessica. This isn't your fault," he said, only to mentally repeat that to himself. This isn't her fault. He met her eyes and felt gutted all over again. Even if he told her she was never going to say yes to him, he'd given her no reason to. I've just put something off for a long time." Smirking, she said, "You're a little young for a midlife crisis, Malcolm." She pulled a bottle of bourbon from the cabinet, much nicer than he ever remembered her drinking before. He was even more surprised when she poured them both a glass and put the bottle away. "Nothing like that," he said wryly, accepting the glass she held out. "I've just ignored something I should have paid better attention to." or like any attention to. He hesitated. He didn't want to say anything. In fact, Malcolm told himself that he wouldn't mention it would upset her and maybe even get him thrown out of the apartment. But conspiring with Trish had got him here in the first place. I hate to bring this up, and if I didn't know about Peter, I probably wouldn't, he said slowly, forcing himself to relax despite the odd look he was getting. But have you spoken to Trish lately? No, she said sharply, hands balling into fists. You didn't tell her I had him, did you? No, of course not, he assured quickly. I promised you I wouldn't. She came to your office last weekend while you were out, Jess snorted. She keeps trying to call me. Nearly every day now, surprised she hadn't tried for another visit. I told her not to, he admitted sheepishly, and I may have said some not very nice things to get her to leave. She lifted her brows at him, an almost approving smirk on her lips. Is that so? What made you bring it up then? I'm sure you figured it out, that the blonde woman in the mask all over the newspapers is her, he asked dryly. At Jess' nod, he added, she confessed that she's gotten involved with someone who may try to kill her friends and family. Dude's already killed her friend's sister, and she keeps trying to call because she's worried he's gonna get to you too. Jessica snorted again. I can handle. Her voice was abruptly cut short, and she met his stare with widened eyes. Peter. It was his turn to nod. Normally I would have just let her talk to you, but I knew you didn't want her near him, and I understand why. But if it's already been this long and you haven't been in danger, I don't think this dude's managed to connect the dots between Trish and you. Her jaw tightened in anger. She better hope that he doesn't. Malcolm wouldn't tell her the other secret he'd been keeping. He was as much a coward as Jessica described, but telling her was at best an ill-fated and poorly timed disaster. At worst, it was a self-serving confession to convince her to give him a chance that he wasn't even sure he deserved. As surprisingly awesome as motherhood made her feel, there was one very specific instant that Jessica could definitely have lived without. Monday morning. She has no idea how Matt managed to get up and get both of them ready at 6 a.m., but she only had to do it one day a week, and it was a struggle. Sorry, buddy, she said guiltily, scooping him up from the sidewalk. This was my fault. I overslept. Peter, her tiny angel, shrugged his little shoulders. I didn't wake up on time either. It's okay, Jess. You're a trooper, kid, she sighed and looked around them. There's no way we're gonna make it to the first bell on time. Since we're already late, let's find you an Egg McMuffin and some orange juice. Peter feels the odd sensation beforehand, but he can't tell where it was coming, and it wasn't urgent yet. By the time they're leaving McDonald's and Peter suddenly felt painful tingling throughout his skin, it was too late. A man walking by bumped into Jess, nearly dislodging her hand from Peter's. Hey! She barked, tucking him closer to her body, putting herself between him and the stranger. Watch where you're going, dude. Oh, I'm sorry, he said pleasantly, turning to look at the two of them. Peter was cowering behind his mother, barely visible behind Jessica's legs. Say, aren't you Jessica Jones? Peter could hardly breathe. This man was dangerous. He was so dangerous that his voice made Peter's skin crawl, and his beady, blue-eyed stare made him feel like someone was holding a knife to his throat. Softly, he tried to wheeze through it. He should stop hiding behind Jess. She didn't know how much danger they were in. Peter should protect her. Instead, he trembled and gasped and watched Jess square her shoulders and say, Yeah, what's it to you? The man blinked, slow and lizard-like. It's nice to meet a real-life hero. You stopped that psychotic woman who killed a police officer, right? Half the reason she was so furious at Trish was the fallout after she killed Elisa. People gave her the credit for the death of an unknown woman, a woman who'd killed a cop, and they celebrated her for it. celebrated Jessica for killing her own mother, for committing an act that she hated. Gritting her teeth, she replied, "So they tell me." Peter couldn't handle the pressure of remaining in this man's presence anymore. Wheezing with terrified panic, Peter gasped the one word guaranteed to pull Jessica's attention away from the creepy stranger. "Mom?" "Oh my God," she said, staring at him in horror. "Peter? Peter, are you choking?" "Asthma," he managed to croak. Through the paralyzing fear, it was actually a code word that May gave him for moments like these. It was supposed to mean, "May, get me away from here." "You have asthma?" Jessica said, a word that May wouldn't have liked, before scooping him up and booking it right back into the McDonald's behind them. Peter was shocked when she plopped him into a chair and knelt in front of him. "Sit up straight," she said, pulling his shoulder back. "Try to take deep breath with me, Pete. Just like that, yeah?" It was getting easier to breathe, but only because they were getting farther and farther away from the scary man. Peter sat up straight in the chair, both hands clutching desperately at Jess's jacket. "That's it, buddy. Good job," she praised, rubbing his back internally. Her brain was screaming, "He called me Mom. Again, he called me Mom." "Huh, your files never said that you have asthma." "How did you know what to do?" he asked, standing shakily from the chair. Silently, he promised that he would be more vigilant, that he would stay more alert. What if the man had tried to hurt his mom? His mom. Jess brushed his bangs from his eyes. "I had it when I was a kid, too. You're probably gonna grow out of it in a couple years." It was even true. No super experiments needed. It did mean she spent a lot of years failing gym class, though. He was pretty active, and it never bothered him before, so it must not be that severe. Maybe he was already growing out of it. Matt rarely got ill, though, and he had a pretty healthy diet, but half of the time, he took pretty shitty care of himself otherwise. So maybe Peter got some of his crazy healthy genes. More and more, she was thinking of talking to Matt about an appointment with a pediatrician. First migraines and now asthma? What else had Peter's medical file left out? And all of these thoughts were honestly just Jessica's way of distracting herself from the M word he said earlier. Peter was still thinking and worrying about the man with the beady eyes. What if he came back again, when Peter wasn't there to protect Jess? When he couldn't steer her away from him? What if he tried to hurt her? He could. Peter was sure of that. Sure as he knew his own name, Peter wasn't exactly sure how strong he'd gotten. May made him practice controlling it constantly, so that he didn't break doors and dishes and people. It had been a while, months, since he'd tried to do something with all his strength. But he was pretty sure he was stronger than a normal adult. Blocks away, Salinger pondered his encounter with the abrasive Miss Jones. Interesting. No one had ever mentioned her having a child, but the boy had certainly addressed her as his mother. He could almost think he tracked down the wrong Jessica Jones, but her picture was plastered across the papers, the media hoax of a hero, a lying, unnatural cheater just like her meddling sister. But the child could complicate things a little more. Jessica had, of course, called Matt and told him about the mishap that morning, and Matt was appropriately worried. He listened hard to Peter's lungs as he ran to greet Matt, but there was nothing wrong with them. Actually, his breathing sounded clearer than most people's. Maybe Jessica's theory was right. Maybe he was already growing out of it. To his surprise, the first thing out of Peter's mouth was, "Did you call Jess?" Matt smiled, his keen ears catching the slipped consonant. "Right now?" "Uh-huh." His smile grew as Peter eagerly held his arms up to be carried, already trying to grab for Matt's phone as Matt lifted him. He shouldn't, he knew that. Matt should try harder to make him walk around on his own. 7 was too old for him to be demanding that he be picked up and carried like a toddler. But the parenting books had already said that some regression was common in a child who'd experienced trauma. He couldn't really regress developmentally since Peter was already way past potty training and learning to walk and talk. His math and language skills were far above a child his age, but it seemed this was one area where he'd slid back and a little, and he guiltily enjoyed every minute of it. Matt was hoping that when Peter felt more secure, he would run ahead of him and refuse to hold his hand like other children his age, even as he dreaded that day. Peter clung to the front of Matt's suit. His dad had a nice, familiar smell that lingered in his memory. Somewhere, he could never tell where it was from, though. He didn't quite know how to work his phone. It wasn't designed for someone who had working vision. "Call Jessica," Matt told the device. "Speakerphone on." "Calling Jessica," it agreed. "Speaker mode on." Peter's heart beat faster, an odd skipping rhythm that calmed as Jessica answered. "Miss me already, Murdoch?" "Hi, Jess." Matt couldn't hear Jessica's heartbeat over the phone, but he did hear the immediate warmth that infused her voice. "Hey, Spider Monkey, you're early." "I missed you," Peter said, and Matt hid a grin. "What are you doing?" I'm in my office," she said, melting into goo. "I missed you too, Pete. What did you learn in school today?" "Well, my science teacher..." That night, Peter got tired early. This didn't surprise Matt at all. He'd spend the whole evening bouncing restlessly around the apartment and using the tablet to text silly gifs and emojis to Jessica. Matt was concerned enough that before dinner he taught him a basic series of meditation exercises. Still, he tired quickly, and Matt walked him through bedtime nearly an hour earlier than he usually would. He was thinking of taking an early night himself. Matt was draped over the couch, eyes closed, supposedly listening to a podcast Karen and Danny had been raving about, but he was too sleepy to absorb anything he was hearing. He was perilously close to just falling asleep on the couch, actually. Then, in the bedroom, Peter's heart suddenly exploded. "Daddy!" Instantly more awake, Matt bolted up from the sofa, nearly kneecapping himself on the coffee table as he scrambled to get to Peter. Peter had been dreaming about trick-or-treating with Batman and Catwoman. But in his dream, they weren't Batman and Catwoman, they were Mom and Dad. He was just as excited, just as enthusiastic to walk through the streets holding their hands. But then the man was there, staring at him so closely that Peter could feel it on his skin, a cold blade sitting below his jaw. He screamed in panic without even knowing what he was saying, just the sound that tore out of him until his throat was raw. Matt could feel how violently Peter was shaking as he lifted him up from the mattress. "Shh, Daddy's here. It's okay. It's okay. Come on, Petey." Frantically, Peter scrambled to tuck himself under Matt's shin, simultaneously trying to attach himself more firmly to his dad and make himself a smaller target. "I'm here, baby. Everything is fine. Shh. Daddy's got you." It took a long time for Peter to calm down, and Matt didn't even bother putting him back in his own bed. He slept with Matt that night, the only time he'd ever done that, going into his 3rd week of living with them. He didn't have another nightmare that week, but he did crawl into bed next to Matt Wednesday night and sleep in his bed again. He didn't call Matt Dad again, nor did he call Jessica Mom, and neither of them pestered him about it. Every day after school, his first question was inevitably, "Can we call Jess?" Matt did do some gentle questioning, trying to poke and prod about his schoolwork, his friends, anything that would hint at the reason Peter's nightmares had suddenly ratcheted up. But there was nothing he asked about that gave him any clues. On Friday, Jessica had one eye on the video footage rolling on her laptop and one eye directed at the alarm clock on her phone. Costa had dropped by yesterday with some not strictly on the books work for her, and she had warned him, just like she'd warned Hogarth, that during weekend hours she would do only minimal investigative work, desk tasks only. Hogarth, she'd given her guidelines on, with no explanation. Costa did actually like, and she needed him to take her conditions seriously, so she told him the truth, and he looked surprised, which was expected, and congratulated her, which wasn't. After another glance at the alarm, which would tell her it was time to pick up Peter from school, someone knocked on the office door. A dark shadow standing in front of the door. "It's open," she called without bothering to look up. A familiar voice said, "Hello, Jess." Momentarily startled, Jessica glanced up at her, sneered, and said, "Goodbye, Dorothy." Dorothy Walker had never been needed, liked, or wanted in Jessica's life, and that was truer now than it ever was. Just having her here set her on edge. Dorothy didn't know about Peter. Well, of course she knew that Jessica had gotten pregnant 8 years ago and given birth to a healthy child. But she was also under the impression that Jessica had given that child up for adoption willingly. She wasn't close enough to either woman to know more. She would certainly have no idea that Jessica had taken custody of that child back. The only way Dorothy knew how to love someone was to exploit them. And Jessica was smart enough to have figured that out years ago. Her uncharming attitude and abrasive manners had kept Dorothy from parading her out in front of cameras at every opportunity the way she'd done to Trish. Peter, on the other hand, was hard not to love. Peter was exceptional in every single way, and the only way Dorothy was ever going to sink her hooks into him was over Jessica's dead body. Trish might allow her mother to pimp her out, but nobody was doing that to Jessica's son. Lips pursed into a thin, angry line, Dorothy said, "I'm not leaving." Jessica glanced up at her again, brows raised to her hairline. "Do you want to leave down the elevator or out the window?" "I want to hire you," she said impatiently. "No, anything else?" Her phone chimed its alarm, flashing the time at her. 2:45, time for her to leave. "Trish is missing," she hissed. "Go find someone who cares." She drawled, even as her heart skipped a beat. "Malcolm said this guy Trish had gotten involved with was really dangerous." Of course, he hadn't said how he was dangerous either. Stopping her foot a little, Dorothy said, "I don't want to be here any more than you want me here." She looked around the room with a hint of disgust. 24 hours ago, she just fell off the map. I should have seen it coming. She'd been late for appointments, distracted, out all night. She won't say where, but she's never missed work until yesterday. She could be using again, in danger or worse. Ordinarily, Jessica would have assumed it was Trish's drug problem that came back to rear its ugly head, but with Malcolm's info, she already had some idea what was probably going on. She shrugged dismissively. If that's what Trish wants to do, then that's her business. Dorothy huffed, putting a hand on her hip. She did look genuinely upset. I will pay you. No, Jessica said shortly. Please, Dorothy pleaded softly, shoulders slumping. Something's wrong. No, Jessica repeated in an even harder tone, looking up at her to stare her down. If you're worried, call the police. Fill out a missing persons form. It's been 24 hours. They can help you. I can't, Dorothy said anxiously. The publicity. Jessica snorted. Call the police or contact someone else. I'm the best in the business, but any PI will be discreet with their clients, or they wouldn't be in business long. She grabbed her coat and shut the laptop down. Either way, I'm closed for the day. Closed? Dorothy demanded. It's not even 3 o'clock, Jessica. I know exactly what time it is, Jessica said, tucking her phone into her pocket and gesturing Dorothy out the door. Her adoptive mother gaped at her as she watched Jessica lock the office behind them. You're actually serious. She's your sister. She's your moral compass. Jessica didn't even bother looking at her as she walked away, slipping her keys back into her jacket. Both of you keep telling me that, but then the two of you want me to bail her out of the shit she lands in. Night, Dorothy. If it weren't for Peter, if she didn't already know that getting involved in this could hurt him, Jessica silently acknowledged that she probably would have gone after her. Even now, part of her worried about what could have happened to Trish, but the larger part of her was worried about what this guy could do to a defenseless 7-year-old. With this on her mind, nobody could fault Jessica for panicking when Peter didn't come running for her. The crowds were getting thin. Dorothy had held her up a little, and there was no reason she shouldn't be able to find him. Some of the buses were already leaving. Peter, she called, already feeling sick with fear. Come on, Spider Monkey, it's time to go home. Peter! There were 2 small shapes sulking at the end of the schoolyard, right around the school garbage bins. The blue and red striped were Jessica's best clue, and she immediately jogged toward him. Her son quickly stood to his full height at her approach, guiltily placing himself between 2 of the bins. Hi! What are you doing down here? She asked suspiciously, stomach still swirling with anxiety. Why didn't you come when I called for you? There was a gentle, plaintive whining from behind him, and a snout covered in blue-gray fur licked at the tips of Peter's fingers. He giggled, almost despite himself, before realizing that his secret was now out. Jessica sighed. Peter... He was so hungry, Peter said, chin wobbling. Strays can be dangerous for people, Peter, she said, hating to say no to him. You can't keep him, little man. You won't get to see him much at my house, and I know some blind people have dogs, but Matt isn't good with animals, baby. Truthfully, she suspected that animals made Matt a little nervous. They were far less predictable than people, and Matt was even more reluctant to hurt an animal, even by accident, than he was to hurt people. He shook his head furiously with loyal certainty. He's really gentle, Jess, I promise, as if to punctuate this point. The dog, geez, it was hardly more than a puppy, sniffed. sniffed its way over to his other hand to lick that one clean too. With a helpless gesture, he said, "I couldn't just leave him out here by himself. He could get hurt." She, Jess corrected absently. "It's a girl dog, Pete." She was a rather beautiful pit bull, up with smoky blue-gray fur, a stripe of white just below her chin, leading to a larger white patch at her chest, and she tilted her head in Jessica's direction, tongue out in a sweet doggy grin. "I couldn't just leave him out here." Jessica sighed again, longer and more heavily. Already she was resigning herself to taking the dog home, as she realized why Peter had gotten so attached to the damn thing in the first place. The freaking dog was blind. End of story.